Ma'am, stop right there. Federal agents, we need to see identification now.
Excuse me? You're in my home. Do you have a warrant? Get out.
We don't need one. We arrest who we want. Hands behind your back.
At exactly 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, on a quiet residential street in Oakmont, Georgia, a doorbell camera captured something that would end 5 federal careers permanently. 5 white male ICE agents were physically restraining a black woman in business attire, dragging her down the porch steps of her own home. What those agents didn't know in that moment would cost them everything. They assumed she was just another target, another name on a list, another person who wouldn't fight back. They didn't bother to verify who actually lived at that address. They didn't check public records. They didn't do even the most basic investigation. And within 120 minutes of putting their hands on her, that laziness, that arrogance, that assumption would trigger a Department of Justice criminal investigation that would consume their lives. Before the sun set that day, the Georgia governor's office was making calls. The Department of Homeland Security secretary was being personally briefed. And those 5 federal agents' faces, captured on camera, preserved in digital evidence, would soon be Exhibit A in a criminal trial. The lead agent, Gary Sullivan, 6 years in federal prison. His career, his pension, his freedom, gone. And he had no idea it was coming. Before I tell you what happens to these agents, I need you to subscribe. Why? Because stories like this need to be told, and you need to be part of spreading the truth. Now comment. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Gary Sullivan was 41 years old and had been an ice field supervisor for 14 years. Inside the Atlanta regional office, and he had a nickname, the Closer. It wasn't a compliment in the way you might think. It meant he got results no matter what it took. And what it took, apparently, was a pattern of behavior that had generated 3 internal complaints for excessive force, all of them dismissed. Sullivan had a reputation for not taking excuses from his targets. He drove a pickup truck with a Punisher skull decal on the back window. His recent performance reviews praised his aggressive deportation numbers. That's the kind of agent Gary Sullivan was. But the complaints weren't just internal whispers. In the past 2 years alone, 7 formal complaints had been filed against Sullivan by Latino community leaders. The accusations were specific. He was targeting homes in affluent Black and Latino neighborhoods without proper warrants. So 2 of those incidents involved minor children who were present during the raids, terrified and traumatized. His supervisors were aware. They noted the complaints in their reports, but they cited the difficult nature of immigration enforcement and moved on. Community advocates had been documenting Sullivan's pattern for 18 months, building a file, gathering evidence, and nobody in his chain of command stopped him. Nobody pulled him off the street. Nobody said enough. Sullivan didn't work alone. He had a team that functioned like an extension of his own mindset. Rachel Foster, 38, had been with ICE for 9 years and followed Sullivan's lead without question. Craig, 35, 7 years on the job, was known for his intimidation tactics, the kind of agent who used his presence as a weapon. Brian Coleman, 29, who was the newest member of the team at just 4 years in, eager to prove himself, eager to impress Sullivan. And Lisa Chang, 32, 6 years with ICE, typically handled the paperwork and logistics. They had all trained together. They all shared Sullivan's so-called results-oriented philosophy. And critically, there was zero pushback culture within this unit. If Sullivan said jump, they asked how high. If Sullivan said break down a door, they grabbed the battering ram. That Tuesday morning, the team gathered for a briefing at the ICE Atlanta field office. Sullivan walked in holding a single printed page, an anonymous tip claiming that the mayor of Oakmont was employing undocumented workers at her home. There was no verification process initiated. No one called the mayor's office. No one checked employment records. And no one requested a warrant from a judge. Sullivan looked at his team and told them it was time to send a message that nobody gets a pass. And that was it. That was the entire plan. They loaded into 2 black SUVs and began the 45-minute drive to Oakmont. When they arrived, they found themselves in an upscale subdivision, tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, American flags hanging from porches. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood Sullivan usually operated in, and maybe that's what made him so determined. He was about to send a message. He just had no idea what that message would cost him. Mayor Melissa Wright was 47 years old and in her 3rd term leading the city of Oakmont. That Tuesday morning, she was standing in her kitchen wearing a cream blouse and navy slacks, reviewing city budget reports at her counter, where her reading glasses were perched on her nose. Next to her sat a coffee mug that read, "Oakmont Strong." Her home was a modest colonial. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant. On the walls were photos of her late husband, an Army veteran, and their 2 adult children. Her daughter was set to graduate from law school the following month. Her son worked as a teacher in Atlanta. Wright had been awake since 5:30 that morning, preparing for an 11 a.m. city council meeting that would determine the future of several key initiatives she'd been fighting for. And those initiatives mattered. Today's agenda included approving a new community policing program that Wright had personally championed, a program that would add mandatory body cam requirements and create a civilian oversight board. She'd been working closely with immigrant advocacy groups to establish sanctuary city protections, policies that would shield vulnerable families from exactly the kind of aggressive enforcement tactics that ICE agents like Gary Sullivan specialized in. Just weeks earlier, she'd been featured in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for reducing citywide crime by 31% over 3 years. Her administration had become known for transparency and immigrant-friendly policies. She'd just finished her breakfast, oatmeal and fruit, the same disciplined routine from her track and field days at Spelman College. But Melissa Wright wasn't just a mayor. She was a widow. 4 years earlier, her husband had died of cancer, and she still wore his Air Force ring on a chain around her neck, close to her heart. Tuesday mornings, she called her mother. "I'm a retired teacher living in Savannah." On her kitchen windowsill sat plants from the community garden project she'd started. Taped to her refrigerator was children's artwork from an elementary school visit the week before. She was known for personally answering constituent emails every single evening, no matter how late it got. Her neighbors described her as the mayor who actually lives here, not in some gated community. Melissa Wright lived among the people she served. She was one of them. At 8:57 a.m., 2 black SUVs pulled up to her curb. Wright glanced out the window, saw the vehicles, and went back to reviewing her documents. She assumed it was something related to city business, maybe a federal grant meeting, maybe a courtesy visit. At exactly 9 a.m., there was aggressive pounding on her front door. Not a knock. Pounding. She walked to the door calmly, looked through the peephole, and saw men with badges. She opened the door with the chain still attached, greeting them with a good morning and asking how she could help. She had no idea her life was about to change forever. Gary Sullivan didn't introduce himself properly. There was no courtesy, no respect. He simply told her they needed to come inside. Wright responded calmly, identifying herself as Mayor Melissa Wright and asking to see their warrant. Sullivan told her they didn't need a warrant for immigration investigations. Wright kept her composure, explaining that this was her private residence and asking what the visit was regarding. Sullivan's hand moved to the doorframe, testing the chain. Rachel Foster and Craig positioned themselves on either side of the door, flanking her field of vision. And this was an intimidation tactic, and Wright recognized it immediately. Then came the accusation. Sullivan informed her they had information she was employing undocumented workers. Wright looked genuinely confused, explaining she didn't employ anyone at her home. All her employees worked for the city. Sullivan told her she was going to answer their questions. Wright replied that she was happy to cooperate, but needed to see identification and understand the legal basis for their presence. Sullivan's tone shifted. He told her she was in no position to make demands. Wright corrected him. She wasn't making demands. She was invoking her Fourth Amendment rights. Brian Coleman stepped closer, his hand drifting near his hip. The threat was unspoken, but clear. That's when Sullivan muttered to Craig, just loud enough for Wright to hear, that she was another one who thinks a title means something. Wright heard it. She held her composure and said she was going to call her attorney. Sullivan's voice rose, telling her she wasn't calling anyone until they were done. Wright reached for her phone sitting on the entry table. Sullivan barked at her to put the phone down. Wright stayed calm but firm, reminding him she had the right to legal counsel. And then Sullivan said the words that her doorbell camera and Ring security system captured with perfect clarity, that these DEI hire types always think rules don't apply. Wright, still holding her phone, made a decision. She told them she was going to step back and close the door, and they could return with a warrant. Sullivan responded immediately, accusing her of obstructing a federal investigation, or so Wright corrected him. She wasn't obstructing anything. She was exercising her constitutional rights. Sullivan nodded to Craig and Coleman. Wright saw the signal. She stepped back quickly, knowing what was about to happen. Sullivan yelled that she was resisting and to open the door. Wright said clearly for the cameras that she was not resisting. She was securing her home and asking them to leave her property. Rachel Foster pulled out her personal phone and started recording. Craig reached forward and tested the door chain with his hand, and then Gary Sullivan's shoulder hit the door. The chain snapped with a metallic crack that echoed down the quiet street. The door swung inward violently, slamming into Wright's arm. She stumbled backward into her foyer. Sullivan entered first, but claiming she had just assaulted a federal officer by slamming the door. Wright's voice was shaking now, but she stayed strong, insisting she had done no such thing. He had broken into her home. All 5 agents flooded into her house. Coleman grabbed her phone from her hand. Craig moved to her left side. Foster moved to her right. Lisa Chang stood near the doorway, visibly uncomfortable, but she said nothing. Wright tried to step back toward her kitchen. Sullivan shouted at her to stop moving. Craig grabbed her left arm. Foster grabbed her right. Wright said clearly that they were hurting her, and she was not resisting. Sullivan ordered her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. Wright complied immediately. She turned around. Craig forced her hands behind her back with unnecessary roughness. Her reading glasses, the ones she'd been wearing while reviewing her budget reports, fell off her face and hit the hardwood floor. The frames cracked audibly. Sullivan pulled out handcuffs and clicked them onto her wrists too tight. Wright winced, telling him they were too tight and cutting off her circulation. Sullivan's response was cold. He told her she should have thought about that before she resisted. The doorbell camera captured her face in that moment. Pain, confusion, and controlled fear. Across the street, a neighbor walking his dog stopped mid-stride, frozen, watching a black woman in business attire being handcuffed in her own home. Craig forced Wright to sit on her own couch, her budget reports scattered across the floor. Her coffee mug, the one that said Oakmont Strong, tipped over and spilled across her documents. Sullivan stood over her, demanding to know where they were. Wright asked where who was, insisting she didn't know what he was talking about. Coleman was already in her kitchen, opening drawers. Foster was going through her home office, visible from the living room. Wright reminded them this was an illegal search and they had no warrant. Sullivan claimed they had probable cause. Wright challenged him. Based on what? An anonymous complaint? That wasn't probable cause. Craig leaned in, accusing her of being the one who keeps hiring illegals for her house. Wright said it again, slowly. She didn't employ anyone at her home. This was a mistake. That's when Smith Hahn appeared. Hahn was 62 years old, a retired postal worker who lived across the street. He approached the open front door, calling out to ask if Mayor Wright was all right. Horace Sullivan turned on him, ordering him to step back from their federal investigation. Hahn didn't move, pointing out that was their mayor and asking what was going on. Sullivan snapped that it didn't concern him. Hahn pulled out his phone and started recording. Another neighbor saw the commotion and started recording from their lawn. Wright saw them and said loudly to please call City Attorney Steve Marsh and tell him she'd been detained. Sullivan turned to Hahn, threatening that if he didn't put that phone away, he'd be next. Hahn didn't lower his phone, calmly stating this was public view from a public sidewalk. Two more neighbors emerged from their homes, phones out, recording everything. Sullivan grabbed his radio and transmitted that the subject had been detained for obstruction and suspicion of harboring undocumented individuals. Wright responded immediately, stating that was false. She had opened her door, asked for a warrant, and they had forced entry. Sullivan turned to Craig, and the Ring camera caught every word as he told him to make sure they documented her resistance. Craig nodded, agreeing she had definitely resisted when they entered. Wright looked directly at the camera, stating clearly that she did not resist, and their cameras showed that. Sullivan noticed the doorbell camera then. He looked at Lisa Chang, ordering her to turn it off. Chang hesitated, explaining it wasn't theirs. It was the mayor's. Sullivan told her to disconnect it then. Coleman reached toward the doorbell camera. Smith Hahn yelled from the street that that was destruction of property. Sullivan stopped Coleman with a hand gesture. He knew the cameras were recording. And he didn't care. That's when an Oakmont Police Department cruiser pulled up. Sergeant Jacob Hill, 38 years old, stepped out of the vehicle. He recognized Mayor Wright immediately. Hill approached the door, asking what the situation was. Sullivan responded without looking at him, claiming it was a federal matter, an ICE investigation. Hill looked past him into the house, noting that was Mayor Wright. Sullivan acknowledged they were aware. Hill's tone sharpened as he asked on what grounds she was detained. Sullivan claimed it was an immigration violation investigation. Hill looked confused, questioning whether this was about Mayor Wright and immigration violations. Wright, still handcuffed on her own couch, spoke up. She told Sergeant Hill they had entered without a warrant based on an anonymous complaint. Hill turned to Sullivan, asking to see the paperwork. Sullivan hesitated, then pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it over. Hill read it carefully. He looked up, stating this was just a complaint printout. There was no warrant, no subpoena. The tension in the room shifted. You could feel it. Lisa Chang took a step back from the group. The cameras were still recording. The neighbors were still watching. And Gary Sullivan had just realized he might have made a terrible mistake. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now, because what happens next will show you exactly why those cameras mattered. And drop a comment. Do you think Sullivan knew in that moment just how badly he'd miscalculated? Sergeant Hill looked directly at Gary Sullivan and told him he needed to understand the legal basis for this detention. Sullivan didn't miss a beat, and claiming they had authority under federal immigration law. Hill's response was measured, but pointed. He asked if that authority extended to detaining a sitting mayor in her home without a warrant. Sullivan's justification was already wearing thin. He claimed anonymous complaints gave them the right to investigate. Hill pulled out his own phone and made a call. Everyone in that room could hear him. He identified himself to his chief, explained he was at Mayor Wright's residence, that she was in handcuffs, and that ICE was present. There was a pause. He confirmed that no, he didn't see a warrant. Another pause. He confirmed that yes, there were multiple witnesses recording. The game had changed. Hill approached Mayor Wright, who was still sitting on her own couch with her wrists behind her back. He asked if she was injured. Wright's voice was steady, but pained as she explained her wrists were bleeding from the handcuffs. They were too tight. Hill turned to Sullivan, asking if they could remove the restraints. Sullivan's response was cold. He stated she was detained. Hill didn't back down. He pointed out she was sitting on her own couch surrounded by 5 federal agents. She wasn't a flight risk. Sullivan said nothing. The silence spoke volumes. Hill shifted his attention back to Wright, asking if she had identification. Wright told him her purse was on the kitchen counter. Craig retrieved it without being asked, a small but telling shift in behavior. Hill examined her driver's license and her city ID badge. Everything confirmed her identity and address. Hill looked up and stated the obvious. She lived here. This was her residence. And then came the question that would unravel everything. Hill turned to Sullivan, asking what specifically Mayor Wright was accused of. Sullivan replied she was employing undocumented workers. Hill asked if this was at this residence. Sullivan confirmed that was what they were investigating. Wright spoke up, explaining she didn't employ anyone at her home. She lived alone. Hill pressed further, asking if she had cleaning staff, gardeners, anyone who worked at her home. Wright answered clearly. She had a lawn service, Oakmont Landscaping, which had been in business for 20 years. That was it. Hill asked if there was anyone else. Wright said no, she did her own housework. Hill turned back to Sullivan, and the absurdity of the situation was now undeniable. He asked if Sullivan's complaint was about a lawn service. Sullivan tried to hold his ground, claiming they had reason to believe there were undocumented individuals on the premises. Hill asked the question everyone already knew the answer to. Had they found anyone? Rachel Foster shook her head slightly. Brian Coleman spoke up, admitting the house appeared empty. And then Mayor Wright said something that cut through the room like a knife. Her voice was steady, controlled, and deliberate. She asked Sergeant Hill how long he'd lived in Oakmont. Hill answered 15 years. Wright then asked if he'd ever seen ICE agents at Mayor Patterson's home, the white former mayor. Hill said no. Wright asked about Mayor Lincoln's home before him, another white mayor. Hill again said no. Wright looked directly at Gary Sullivan. She stated that they'd come to hers, and based on an anonymous complaint, they never verified. The statement hung in the air. Smith Hahn's phone captured Sullivan's face in that moment. No response, no defense, just the recognition that he'd been caught. Lisa Chang looked at the floor. The truth was undeniable, and it was on camera. Hill spoke again, insisting the handcuffs be removed unless they had specific charges. Sullivan tried one last time, claiming she had obstructed. Hill cut him off, pointing out that Sullivan's own camera showed she had asked for a warrant. That wasn't obstruction. Sullivan paused, calculating his next move. Finally, he turned to Craig and ordered him to remove the restraints. Craig unlocked the handcuffs. When they came off, Mayor Wright's wrists told the story Sullivan didn't want told. Deep red marks, to small cuts where the metal had dug into her skin. Hill immediately pulled out his phone and photographed the injuries. Wright rubbed her wrists gently, the pain visible on her face. Wright stood up. She stated she wanted a formal report filed and medical documentation of these injuries. Hill nodded, saying he'd call EMS. Sullivan tried to minimize it, claiming that wasn't necessary. Wright's voice was firm as she insisted it absolutely was necessary. This was an assault. Sullivan scoffed, accusing her of exaggerating. Wright looked him in the eye and laid out the facts. He had broken into her home. He had physically restrained her without cause. He had searched her property without a warrant. He had injured her. That wasn't exaggeration. That was fact. Hill radioed for a medical response. From across the street, and a neighbor yelled that they had video of everything. Smith-Hahn shouted that he did too. Another voice called out that they were uploading theirs right now. Gary Sullivan's expression changed. In that moment, he realized the scope of the documentation. This wasn't just a complaint that would get buried in a file. This was evidence. This was viral. This was permanent. Minutes later, Oakmont Police Chief Celine Troy arrived on scene. Troy was 50 years old, a black woman with 25 years in law enforcement. She stepped out of her vehicle and took in the scene, the mayor with injured wrists, 5 ICE agents standing in her living room, neighbors with phones out recording everything. Troy walked up to Sullivan, introduced herself as Chief Troy, and asked him to walk her through what had happened. Sullivan gave an abbreviated account, but carefully omitting the parts that made him look bad. When he finished, Troy asked the simplest question. Did he have a warrant? Sullivan started his usual line about Federal Immigration Authority. Troy interrupted, clarifying that wasn't what she'd asked. Did he have a warrant signed by a judge? Sullivan admitted he didn't. Troy pulled out her phone and walked back to her vehicle. Her voice carried across the yard as she asked to be connected to the U.S. Attorney's office, confirming it was urgent. What happened next happened fast. At the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta, the governor's chief of staff received a call from Oakmont City Attorney Steve Marsh. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia got an alert from Chief Troy. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General was flagged by the U.S. Attorney. The FBI Civil Rights Division was notified within 30 minutes. By 10 a.m., just 1 hour after the arrest, 3 parallel investigations had been initiated. The DOJ Criminal Civil Rights Investigation, the DHS Office of Inspector General Administrative Investigation, the ICE Office of Professional Responsibility Internal Investigation. The Georgia ACLU received a call from neighbor Smith-Hahn. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund was contacted by the Atlanta chapter. Local news stations dispatched crews after seeing the social media posts that were already spreading like wildfire. Sullivan and his team were ordered to return to the Atlanta field office immediately. The drive back was silent. Sullivan checked his phone. 47 missed calls. A news alert popped up on his screen announcing that the Oakmont mayor had allegedly been detained by ICE without a warrant. Video footage was already circulating on Twitter. The hashtag Justice for Mayor Wright was trending. Rachel Foster broke the silence, noting that people were saying this was racial profiling. Sullivan's voice was defensive as he insisted they'd followed protocol. Craig spoke up, doubt creeping into his voice as he questioned whether they really had. They hadn't verified the complaint. Brian Coleman sounded nervous, asking if they should get lawyers. Lisa Chang said nothing. She just stared out the window, knowing what was coming. When they arrived at the ICE office, their supervisors were waiting in a conference room. The regional director didn't waste words, badges and weapons now. They were on administrative leave pending investigation. Meanwhile, back in Oakmont, DOJ investigators arrived by 2 p.m. that same day. They moved with precision, collecting all the doorbell and ring camera footage, the neighbor's cell phone videos, Sergeant Hill's report and photographs, the medical records from EMS showing Mayor Wright's wrist injuries, and the ICE agent's BodyCam footage from all 5 cameras. They pulled Sullivan's personnel file, which showed 3 prior complaints for excessive force, and they pulled the anonymous complaint that had triggered the entire raid. Forensic analysis of that complaint revealed something damning. It had been submitted from an IP address traced to a white nationalist forum. The language was identical to complaints that had been filed against 3 other black elected officials in Georgia. There was no verifiable source information. It never should have been acted upon without verification. Gary Sullivan had raided a mayor's home based on a racist hoax, and he'd done it without asking a single question. By 5 p.m. that same day, the U.S. Attorney released a statement confirming their office had opened a criminal investigation into potential civil rights violations involving the detention of Oakmont Mayor Melissa Wright, emphasizing they took allegations of unlawful detention and excessive force extremely seriously, particularly when they involved public officials exercising their constitutional rights. The Georgia governor issued his own statement, describing Mayor Wright as a dedicated public servant who had served Oakmont with distinction, insisting that if federal agents had violated her rights, and they must be held fully accountable, and noting he had personally spoken with Mayor Wright and offered the full support of his office. Even the DHS secretary, under pressure from the Congressional Black Caucus, weighed in, stating that ICE agents were expected to operate within constitutional boundaries at all times, and this incident was under investigation at the highest levels. Gary Sullivan's world was collapsing, and it had only been 8 hours. 3 days later, Mayor Melissa Wright gave a videotaped deposition to federal investigators. She appeared in professional attire, bandages still visible on her wrists. Her statement was calm, precise, and chronological. She walked them through every moment, every word, every injury. Then she said something that investigators would later describe as devastating and unimpeachable. She explained that she had complied with every lawful order. She had asked for a warrant because that was her right as a citizen. When they forced entry, she didn't fight back. She knew exactly how quickly a black woman defending her home could be labeled threatening. She stayed calm because she had to survive that moment. She described the pain of the handcuffs, the humiliation of being detained in her own home, while her budget reports lay scattered on the floor and her coffee spilled across documents she'd worked on since 5:30 that morning. She noted that her late husband had served this country, and this violation was how she was treated in return. She concluded by stating this wasn't about immigration enforcement. This was about power, assumptions, and contempt. And it was captured on camera. The ICE Office of Professional Responsibility completed its preliminary review and issued findings that left no room for interpretation. There was no valid legal basis for entry without a warrant. The anonymous complaint was never verified per standard protocols. There was no reasonable suspicion that Mayor Wright employed undocumented workers. The use of force was unjustified given her full compliance. The agent's statements were contradicted by video evidence, and a pattern of similar violations was found in Sullivan's case history. The recommendation was clear: termination for all 5 agents. An additional finding noted that supervisors who had approved Sullivan's prior aggressive tactics also faced discipline. The DOJ Criminal Division convened a grand jury. Within 45 days, and that grand jury returned indictments against all 5 agents on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and assault. A federal trial was set for 8 months later. All 5 agents pleaded not guilty. The trial lasted 12 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict came back: guilty on all counts. Gary Sullivan was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for leading the unlawful operation. The judge cited his pattern of constitutional violations and complete lack of remorse. His federal law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He was barred from any security, law enforcement, or government contracting work for life. He was ordered to pay $50,000 in restitution to Mayor Wright. So the judge's words at sentencing were blunt. Sullivan had betrayed his oath and weaponized his authority. Rachel Foster received 5 years in federal prison. Despite brief cooperation during the investigation, she was still held accountable for her active participation in the unlawful entry and physical restraint of Mayor Wright. Her certification was permanently revoked. She was ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution. Craig received 4 years in federal prison. Medical evidence showed that his actions, forcing the handcuffs onto Mayor Wright's wrists, had caused the lacerations documented in the EMS report. His certification was revoked. He was ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution. Brian Coleman, the youngest member of the team, received 3 years in federal prison. The court acknowledged that he had been following his superior's orders, but he was still held accountable for searching Mayor Wright's home without a warrant. His certification was revoked. He was ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution. Lisa Chang received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. She was the only agent who had shown visible discomfort during the incident. She cooperated fully with the investigation and testified against Sullivan at trial. She resigned from ICE before sentencing. Her certification was suspended for 5 years. She was ordered to pay $10,000 in restitution. But the consequences didn't stop with the agents. The ICE regional director was forced into retirement. 2 supervisors who had ignored previous complaints against Sullivan were demoted. The entire Atlanta ICE field office was placed under a DOJ consent decree requiring mandatory verification of all anonymous complaints before action, warrant requirements for residential entries, absent exigent circumstances, BodyCam review by an independent panel for all use of force incidents, quarterly civil rights training, and the creation of a community oversight board with subpoena power. A federal monitor was assigned for 5 years. Mayor Wright filed a federal civil rights lawsuit suing the individual agents and ICE. The case settled before trial for $2.3 million, $1.5 million in compensatory damages, and $800,000 in punitive damages. The settlement also included a written apology from the DHS secretary and a guarantee that the footage from Mayor Wright's cameras would be used in federal training programs. Mayor Wright donated the entire settlement to an immigrant legal defense fund in Oakmont. Gary Sullivan's name is now permanently associated with civil rights violations. A search of his current employment shows him working manual labor. No security clearance possible, no pathway back. Rachel Foster and Craig are similarly unemployable in any law enforcement capacity. Brian Coleman is rebuilding his life after prison and now advocates for criminal justice reform. Lisa Chang works in the private sector and speaks at police academies about the importance of speaking up when you see something wrong. None of them will ever carry a badge again. Their mugshots are now used in training at every federal law enforcement academy in the country. Examples of what not to do. 1 week after the incident, Mayor Wright returned to a city council meeting. The council and a packed gallery gave her a standing ovation. She delivered a speech on the importance of constitutional rights. That day, the council passed the sanctuary city protections she'd been advocating for. The following year, she was re-elected with 71% of the vote, the highest margin in the city's history. She was named Georgia Municipal Association Mayor of the Year. She became a keynote speaker at the NAACP National Convention. Her words at that convention echoed around the country. They tried to make her small in her own home, but instead, they reminded her why she fights. 6 months after the incident, Mayor Wright was back home on a Tuesday morning. Same cream blouse, same coffee mug, reviewing budget reports. She'd installed a new security system, but her door was unlocked. Neighbors waved as they passed. She waved back. She was home, she was safe, and justice had been served. At the ICE Training Academy in Georgia, new recruits now watch the footage from Mayor Wright's doorbell camera. The instructor pauses on the image of her injured wrists. Text appears on the screen. Constitutional rights apply to everyone, everywhere, every time. Then the image changes to Gary Sullivan in handcuffs being led to a prison transport vehicle. The text reads, "Accountability is not optional." The case has become required study in Constitutional Policing 101. Mayor Wright's dignity under pressure has become the standard for how victims should be treated. Your 5 careers ended because one woman knew her rights and had cameras to prove it. This is what accountability looks like when cameras capture truth and the system actually works. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to see more stories where justice prevails, and share this with someone who needs to see that rights still matter. Drop a comment. Do you think the sentences were fair? Let's discuss.